Before we start, do we have any questions from yesterday?
Yeah, Professor, I have a
Yes.
question. So,
Yes.
we getting data from parent to child using input and
Mm-hmm.
getting out the data from child to parent. But when we are using event emitter,
Mm-hmm.
we are just only taking out the data, not the function, right?
Yes. So I have some sort of data. I need to pass it up. So I create an output and have the parent listen to that output. Whenever the child decides to send the data, the parent will receive it.
Mm.
And
And
yeah,
and then when we create click in the parent, and when we
mm-hmm.
click in it, we get the child message in the parent.
No, we create the click in the child to send the data out. There is no point of having a click event in the parent to receive data. The parent cannot pull data from the child. The child has to push the data up
When it's clicked.
when it's clicked, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Because if I
Thank
have click in the parent, then the parent is pulling the data, and that's not how it works. The child should push the data up.
Okay. And one more
Okay?
question. So,
Yes.
when I have a constructor or without the constructor, what's the difference?
If you need some logic to trigger at the time of the class being created, instantiated, then pass that to the constructor. So use the constructor whenever you need to run code before anything happens in the component. That's basically the, like, when do we use constructor?
Okay.
Okay,
Okay. Thank you.
good, good questions. Any other questions? Today we're going to look at two more uh, objects in Angular called directives and pipes. And from there, we will learn about services, what are services as well. And with this, we complete all the objects that we can put inside a module. Yesterday, we studied that we have a concept called Angular module. And we learned that inside this module, I can have components. And every time we create a component, we usually, in order to make it visible inside this bubble, we just declare the component inside the declarations array. So we make it visible inside this bubble. Today we will look at how we create also directives and pipes and services. And we will look at special module called HTTP client module that has one service will allow me to send HTTP calls. So we're going to import this module and use the service in order to make HTTP calls. Let's start with directives. So what are directives? Directives usually define behavior or common behavior that you need to replicate in your application. Directives come in a form of attributes that you apply on a host element. So what is a host element? A host element could be any component, whether it's native component or it's an Angular component. And the directive is basically comes in a form of attribute. Let's see an example. If I have a div, I can make this div fly by applying this directive on top of this host element. As you can see, fly comes in shape of attribute. Let's say I have a component called weather. I can apply a directive called, for example, shake on top of this host element weather, which is an Angular component. Also, note here that a directive may or may not accept input or inputs with S. So maybe this directive will accept a value of the speed of the shaking. So you can pass a value that determines the behavior that you want to apply on this weather component. So directives usually define a common behavior that you want to apply on any host element that you may choose. Let's see some common directives that we will use. We have if, ngIf, and ng4. Both of these directives, as you can see, they start with the star. All it means that they are structural directives. And structural directives are DOM unfriendly. The DOM is not happy with them. Why? Because we may make direct changes to the DOM tree when we use ngIf and ng4. And that's why they are marked with a star before their name. We also have attribute directives, and they are DOM friendly. For example, we have ngClass, which is just going to apply classes on the host element, and ngStyle. Both of them, they never change the DOM tree. They change the CSS tree, which is going just to give your components different styling. So let's learn how we use ngIf, ng4, ngClass, and ngStyle in an example. Any questions? I'm going to create a new object. I'm going to call it demo. Okay, cd demo, and then ng-serve. Oh, let me open VS Code first, and then serve the application. In my app component, I'm going to it is the app, and here is my code. Let me clean it up. And I'm going to create a paragraph that says hello. Right? Now, how do I apply ngIf? We just apply it as an attribute on the host element. So I can say ngIf, and then I can pass a condition that's going to be either true or false. So if I passed false, then the component is removed from the DOM. It's not hidden. It's completely removed from the DOM. And when it's true, then the component is going to be displayed in the DOM. Now with this, I can basically create a button that's called switch. And every time I click the button, I'm going to basically switch the value from true to false and vice versa. So let's create this value. So I'm going to create a value called display. With, by default, it has a true value. And here I'm going to have the condition as the display property. And every time I click the switch button, all I need to do is to change this display. So I'm going to say display equal not display. Now when I switch, the element is removed from the DOM, and when I switch back, the element is added back to the DOM. So that's how ngIf basically works. You just pass a Boolean to determine whether this DOM element will be existed or removed from the DOM tree. Let's take a look at ng4 and see how it works. Let's say you have an array of elements. So for example, I have here students array, and it's going to be have an ID, it is an array of objects that I want to display as a list. In order to do that, we're going to use ng4 directive. So what I can do is I can create a paragraph here that will repeat 3 times. So I can say, hey, repeat this element for 3 times. So you create an ng4 attribute on top of the paragraph host element. Now what I can do, I can say, let student of students. Now I created a variable called student that will represent one iteration from the students array. And from there, I can use the double curly bracket to display student.name. Now when I save, I see that 3 paragraphs were added to the DOM tree as an iteration of the students array to display the student name. That's how we could simply use ng4. Any questions? Now let's learn a little bit of some advanced stuff that comes with ngIf and ng4. Now with ngIf, what you could do also after you pass your element, your Boolean, is to set an else statement. So if the condition is false, you probably want to display something else. So here I'm going to create an ng template. The template will never be displayed. Its sole purpose is to exist for JavaScript to use it to display what's within. So I'm going to create an ng template, and here I'm going to create a paragraph that says bonjour instead of hello. How do I use this template? I give it a reference. I'm going to give it French reference. And now I say display else French. Now, if the value is true, this paragraph will be displayed. If the display value is false, then the French template will be displayed. Let's test that. So I'm going to switch. It's bonjour. Switch back. It's hello. As I click, I'm replacing this paragraph with this paragraph alternatively. So that's how we could add an else to the if statement, that directive. Now, let's add some more advanced stuff to the ng4 as well. So what I can do is to use one or more of the predefined variables that comes with the ng4. What I can do is, hey, create something and say let is first equal first. So there's a predefined variable called first, which is only going to be true if okay, so there is a predefined variable called first, and I created a variable called isFirst to represent this first element. Now, what can I do with this first? I could possibly decorate the first element differently. I could possibly hide the first element. It's up to you. What do you want to do? So if you want to hide it, for example, I can add an ngIf, and I say only display is not first. You can't have multiple template binding on one element. Okay. So in order to do that, we should probably create span that has the ngIf and add the element within the span. Now, if I check, the first element is hidden. And the reason is because it's the first element. If I want to hide the last element, then I can use last. So now only the first two elements are displayed. And in the slides, you will see a list of all the predefined variables that you can use with ng4. So you have index to represent the index, count, similar to saying array.length, first and last, even and odd, based on the index value. And we have also something called track by. If you are familiar with React gives you something called key. For every single element you iterate over, you have to attach a key. In Angular, you could define a function and return from that function a unique value, a calculated unique value that will represent the element. So what is this calculated value and why it's helpful to have one? So if you're rendering an array with a lot of elements and you decided to make a change here, you only need to insert that change without changing the other elements. And the framework is only capable of doing so if it knows a unique value for every single element that is displayed. Because if it doesn't, and you change a value here, the framework is going to check, oh, this is same. This is change. Since this one is change, now the framework is going to re-render all the rest of the elements as well. And this is not efficient. If the framework has direct access to every single element, then it will be able to make the change only to that specific element without the need of re-rendering part of big chunk of this list. And that's why we use something to help the framework do that. Now, the good news, Angular by default calculate a unique value, which is good. So we don't need to add it. Recently in the documentation, they changed that recommendation. And now they do recommend that instead of letting the framework calculate this, assist the framework by adding track by function. So let's define one of these track by functions. I'm going to remove this first condition and remove this span. So what I'm going to do now is to say track by my function. Let's define my function. This function is going to accept two values, the index and the element. And it should always return unique value. So what unique value do I have inside this array of students? Probably the student ID, right? So let's return the student ID as a unique value. All right, so let's type now this function. So the index would be always a number, and the element is going to be an object that has ID as number and name as a string. Now the returned value, unique value that I need to return is the element dot the ID. Now if I save, the list is still displayed, but I helped the framework to identify every single element in a unique way without assuming that the framework will automatically calculate this unique value. And this is good and advantage you probably need to add in order to improve performance of any for loop iteration in your templates. Any questions about ng4 and ngf? You notice that yes.
Professor, for like ng4, the loop statement, and for ngf, the conditional statement, we have to write it inline, like we can do it outside in a method.
Very good question. Are you talking about using this ng4 outside the paragraph?
No, I'm like ng4 equals to some method name or some function that we call.
Oh, yeah. No, ng4 you need to basically add define a variable for every single iteration, and you have to use let off.
Okay.
You can't like pass something else. You have to pass let off. And for ngif, you can pass a function. That's fine. Knowing that the function will return a Boolean. Because if the function returns something else, this something else would be casted to a Boolean.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? So we noticed how ngif and ng4 attributes or directives start with star because they were structural directives. They change the structure of the DOM. Let's take a look at other directives that are attribute directives. They just change the style. If you need to apply any style, let's say I have class here that I'm calling red, and that will make the color basically red. If I want to apply this class to any of the elements, what I could do is use the ng class attribute. Now, why adding this using ng class much more comfortable? Let me give you an example. So let me make stand back here. And I want the student name to become red. So what I could do is to say ng class equal, and then I can pass a condition here. I can say the red is true. If I say red is true, so the class red will be applied to every single span. So if I save, ng class accept an object and not a string. So I need to add square brackets. If I forget to add the square brackets, then I'm passing just a string to ng class, and that's never gonna work. In order to evaluate an object to an input, then we learned yesterday that we need to surround the input attribute with square brackets. Now we can see that all three elements has the class attribute applied to them. If I inspect, you see class property and has the red. Now, how is that helpful? Because I can now conditionally set this. So now I can bring back hey, let's odd equal odd. All the odd values now, they have class red, and the even values, so this is 0, 1, 2. So as you can see, probably I should probably add even here in order to have red for the first and third element. That's what I wanted originally. So as you can see now, the even index has a class red applied to it. So by using ngClass, we could flexibly apply a certain class that you define on elements conditionally based on the Boolean value that you pass to the class. So if you pass true, the class will be applied. If you pass false, the class will not be applied. That's how easy it is to apply classes. Now, what about styles? You can also apply styles directly to any element. So let's say here, I want to apply certain styles on the student name. So I can use also ngStyle, which also accepts an object of the styles that you want to apply. And here I can say my object could be color. Let me remove then any coloration here. Good. Sorry. Style. What is type? Boolean is not tracked by function. Oh, I need to add this back. Okay. As you can see, I added color. Let's call it green to every single element, and now they become green. Now you're probably wondering, so why don't I use the style property directly? Because with this one, you can control this object. You can control this object easily. So let's say you have here an empty object that's called student class. And now I'm passing the student class to the ngStyle. So maybe let's call it student style. Why it's called student class. And it starts with an empty object. How about when I click switch, we add some styles dynamically? Let's do that. So now instead of switching display, I'm going to have a method called handle switch. And let's define handle switch. And within handle switch, I'm just going to add some styles to the student style. So I'm going to say this.student style equal. I'm going to create new object, read the old student style so I don't lose them. And then I can add any addition style that I want to add. For example, color is green. Now, initially, all the list items, they won't have any style. When I click switch, all of them, they do have now style color green added to them. If I inspect, you see that every element has a style property now with color green. So basically using ngClass and ngStyle give you more flexibility of how you assign classes or styles to your elements. And this is helpful for an application. Any questions about ngStyle and ngClass?
Can we use external styles like some CSS or
Yeah, it doesn't matter if the CSS was defined here or some other place as an external file. You just import the CSS style in here. Instead of using styles, you can use styles URL or style URLs, probably. And then these styles will be part of the document and you can use them. And if you want to define global styles in your app for your entire app, remember that there is also a file called styles.css, which exists near index.html. It's automatically injected here. It is not. Why it's not injected? Because Angular compiler will do that. Here it is. It will add the styles.css automatically to your index.html and have it part of the application. So you can add any global CSS to this file. Any other questions? So we just learned about 4 built-in directives that we could use: ngIf, ng4, ngClass, and ngStyle. All these 4 are heavily used in any application. And all of these directives are imported basically from the browser module that you imported here in this module. So they don't literally exist. Where is the source code of ngIf? You might be wondering. How am I able to use it? You are using it because you imported the browser module, which is the source of all ngIf and ng4 and ngClass and ngStyle. Also, you will see now next that it is the source of all the pipes that we are going to use in our application too. So what are pipes? Pipes are little cute functions that may change a value in the template. Let's say inside the template, you have string that says welcome everybody's. So if I want to display this message, I would simply going to add the message between 2 double brackets and see the message displayed. Now, how can I apply a function that's going to format this value? There are some built-in pipes that will help you format this value. One of the pipes that you can apply on string is called uppercase. And now when I save, I see that the entire string became uppercase. Now, what kind of pipes that we can apply on, let's say, numbers? Now I have a number here, and this number is pretty hard to use. Oh, I need a semicolon. Is it too big number? I'm not sure. Okay, so I have some number here, and this number represents some number. And as you can see, this number cannot be read. So if I just pipe it with a number, now I make the number is much more visible to read, easier to read. So automatically Angular formats every 3 numbers together to make it easier for any reader to use and read. We can also have something called currency. To format any number in a currency format based on the locale that's used from the browser settings. So if I am inside the States, I will see it in dollar. If I am in Canada, I will see it in Canadian dollar. And you can change the locale dynamically. We can also use pipes in order to format dates. So for example, I have now as date.now. Now, if I want to display this now variable, probably it's something unfriendly to use, to read. While if I pipe this value with date, now I see that the date is much more readable. And we can pass extra parameter to every single pipe. So I can say that this pipe, I want it to be displayed as short date. Now I see that it's 4/1823, comma, and the current time that was this, that's represent this value. So as you can see, we can play with pipes API really nicely to format any value in a template. Any questions? The most heavily pipe that we're probably going to use is date. So you could format date objects coming from the database. Most of the dates are either timestamps or represent a new date value. And the new date value is also not readable because if that's what you want to display, this is something the user will not appreciate. So it's very common that we also always format date values with the date pipe and set what kind of format we want to extract from the date object. And another pipe that's very, very heavily used is async. And it's a pipe that I'm going to use later once we have some asynchronous values. And I'm going to explain to you in details what it does and why it's helpful to use it. That's coming next after the break. But simply, pipes are these little cute functions that are applied on a value in the template, and they will change basically the format of this value. And yes, we can nest multiple pipes together. So if I have here a message that is string and that says, welcome everybody's on class, and let's display back the message. So what I can do with this message is I can pass this value to an uppercase and then pass the uppercase as an input to slice. And now I can slice it from position 4 to position 9. And now when I check, I just sliced this. The uppercase string is applied on the uppercase format. So I can nest multiple pipes together. This one will be applied on the original message, and the output is passed to the slice, which is going to slice the string from position 4 to 9. Any questions? The next concept that we will learn today is about services. So what are services? Services are basically objects that can be used to communicate between components. Probably yesterday I mentioned something that when we used to do child 1 and child 2 and I told you to pass some information between child 1 and 2. What you had to do is to send it up to the parent, and the parent sent it back to the child, and that was good practice. But wouldn't it be nice if I have some sort of a direct communication channel between child 1 and child 2 without having the parent or grandparents to be involved in this communication? And that's basically the role of a service. A service basically is an object that can be used to communicate between two messages. It could be used as also a layer to define some sort of an API to communicate with the backend. So all services can use this layer as a common ground to communicate with the backend. And that's what the two main purposes for services. So they are objects that can be used either to communicate between two non-parent-child components, or they can be used as literally service layer, as of an MVC, a service layer, to communicate with a backend server. And we will use services for these two main purposes. Now, services, once you have an application, now the nice about them, I can communicate between any two components. Let's say this component and that component and this component. And in order for this to happen, I need the service to be provided at certain level that's visible to both of these nodes. So every single service need to be provided. What does it mean provided? A provider is going to create an instance of the service. So the service is basically a class, okay? Just a class. And in order to use this class, I need someone to create an object for me. So while you can yourself create an object, this is an anti-pattern. So let's say you have a service that says calculate price. Okay? So you have a class called calculate price, and this class will give you methods to calculate price of a product. Let's say you were responsible for instantiating this class. So you create an instance here, you create an instance here, you create an instance everywhere. You're just creating an instances for the same service. One, that's consume memory, and that's bad. Two, what if the constructor of calculate price now requires a zip code to add probably state tax? Then you will have to revisit all your components that use the service in order to add to the constructor the zip code. That's really make a coupled relationship between your component and the service, and it's also bad. So a solution for this is dependency injection. Dependency injection. What is a dependency injection? Is this space where it's responsible of creating instances of anything you want. So you are not responsible for this creation of these instances. And the way we ask for an instance, hey, I need an instance of this. I need an instance of this. The dependency injection will create, I no longer create the instance myself. I just ask for it. I need an instance of type calculate price. The dependency injection will locate this service, create an instance, and provide the instance to the component. If another component asks for the same type, I need to calculate price. The dependency injection will see that we already have a same instance created before. So it's going to deliver the same instance to the other component. So what we accomplish when we provide all our services at root level is to have a singleton to all services, plus we decouple the component from the whoever is creating the class. That's another advantage. And this way, basically, we consume less memory and we guarantee that our code is more testable and easier and more performant to run. So that's why we are going to use the dependency injection framework to provide most of our services at root level, which is the highest level of any components tree. Now, can I provide any service at local level? Yes, I can provide a service here, and that will be available for this branch. I don't see why would anybody create a service and provide it at local level, but it is possible. But most of the times we are going to create services that are provided at root level, and we just ask for these services from the root injector. Any questions?
Professor,
Yes,
the service only be created when we inject it into some components, or it will create when the app will start.
very good question. Service is created only when you ask for it. So let's say you have an application, and this application has multiple services. All services will be scanned with the project, and the application should be aware of them. This is called root injector. And every component has its own provider as well. However, we're going to use the root provider. So you will see now when I create a service within my code, I will inject and I will provide the service at root level. Now, when this component asks for service S1, there is no instance yet created. So the root injector will create an instance and provide this instance to component A. Let's say component B also requires an instance of S1. It will ask the root injector for the service. The root injector will see that I have also an instance, so it will not create a new one. It will provide the same instance to component B. Now, everything I explained is wrong. Why is that? Because a component doesn't ask for a service from the root injector. Usually, the component itself requires an instance of S1. So how is the root, the dependency injection algorithms work? In reality, the actual dependency injection algorithms start from the component itself. So the component is going to question itself. Did I provide S1? Do I have a local dependency for H1? If yes, I'm going to create my own instance. If no, I'm going to check my parents. And the parents will do the same. If we have provided the service here, we will use the same instance for this branch. Otherwise, it's going to check the parent. And then the parent until we reach to the root injector. And now the root injector will see that, yes, I have a service S1 provided in root level, and it will provide the service to this component B. So the dependency injection algorithm starts with every single provider all the way up until I reach to the root injector. But since all of your services are going to be provided in root, you can just assume that you're directly asking for a root service. But actually, if anybody of these components did provide S1, now an S1 will be shared only for this branch, and this one will have its own S1. So you need to be careful when you define local providers. And if we reach to the root injector and we don't see a provider for S1, you will receive an application error that someone is asking for a service called S1 and this S1 was not found. So you need to be careful. Any questions?
Yeah, Professor.
Good. Yes. Let's see a small
Professor,
example of
I have a question.
services. Yes.
So the root injector runs at the initialization of the application?
Yes, correct. Not to create instances, just to be aware of the services that are available. So all of these services are kind of classes that are registered in the root injector. And once a component asks for this instance, the root injector is going to create an instance if it doesn't exist already, and deliver it to the component.
Thank you.
Let's see an example of a service. I need now my trusty CLI to create the service. So I'm going to ng generate, and I'm going to generate a service. I'm going to call it common. As you can see, a service common was created. If I inspect my code, I see that I have class, and this class is decorated with @injectable. And you see that I provided this service in root level. So that's good. All you need to do later is to ask for this service and use it. Let's say inside your service, you have a full name that is Saad. And you want to use this service and read this property from this class. You need somebody to provide you an instance of this class. How is that possible? You just ask for this type. Once you ask for this type, the root injector, because the service is provided in root, will create an instance and give you an instance of this class. So let's ask for this service and try to display the value. I'm going to go back to my app component. And in my app component, I'm going to inject the service. So I'm going to say common equal inject common service. Control space and control space, or control space. And I import this inject. And now I have an instance of the service. So this basically an object. It's just like calling new common service. But you don't do that. Instead, to create an instance, you just ask for the type. You say inject this service. Angular dependency injection will create the instance and give you an instance here. Now I can simply, for example, here display common dot full name. And when I save, I see that my name is displayed in this paragraph, which is the value of the full name that came from the service. Yes? So injecting a service is simply kind of calling a new common service. However, calling a new common service often will create multiple instances, but asking for the service is going to create a singleton of the service. So the next time another component asks for the same service, the same instance will be delivered and Angular will not call new service again. So that's good for testability, code separation, responsibility. There are so many software development concepts that recommend that you use such pattern. Any questions about services? Let's take a break, and after the break, we can do a little bit more with services before we move to more advanced concepts. Let's take a break. Right, welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we learned about directives, ng4, ngif, and styling and classes. And then we looked at concept called service and pipes. And then we learned about services, and we discovered that services are classes. Usually they are provided in root level to create a singleton and a common place for multiple components to use. So how about we replicate yesterday's homework, and instead of passing the data between A and B through the parent, how about we use a service to make this communication? And in order, before I do any kind of communication of that kind, I would like to introduce a concept probably you are already familiar with called observables. So what are observables? Observables basically are stream. So it's observable, doesn't have any values by default. It's a stream of values. So you can't read the observable value by saying observable.value. An observable is a stream. You need to subscribe to the stream before you can read any passing values. That's by default an observable. Now, Angular supports observables really heavily everywhere, and you're going to start seeing that now in services, later when we manage the state, later when we do HTTP requests, tomorrow with forms and routing. You will see that observables or streams of data are passed everywhere. And as I mentioned, the stream is basically just an ongoing line of data that doesn't have current data. You need to subscribe to the stream, and whenever a value arrives, all the subscribers will be notified. So it's like the observer pattern, design pattern. Now there are multiple types of these observables. Some observables, they do hold the default value. And every single time you add a new value, it will be held in this kind of like, it will replace the default value with the new value. So any new subscribers or anybody trying not to subscribe, just to read the default, the recent value is capable of doing so. And this kind of observables, we call them behavior subjects. So by default, an observable is the stream of values. You need to subscribe to them to read their values. Some types of observables, like behavior subject, may hold a default value, and every new value arrives replaces the previous value. This way, we could use probably behavior subject as a stream that does have a value that represent possibly your application state. So all components can subscribe, read, change the state, and interact with each other. So that's the concept of observables or streams. And Angular uses a library called RxJS, which is part of the Rx library, which does provide everything about the streams that we will use in this course for all programming languages. So you can use it with your Java application, C#, PHP. There are a variety of technologies that using this Rx library to provide such really reactive objects to all programming languages. So we're going to start using observables next. So let me create two components, siblings, display them, and try to communicate between these two components. I'm going to go back to my terminal and create two components. And generate component. I'm going to call it 1. And I'm going to create a component called 2. Let's display both components as siblings in app component. So I'm going to display 1 and 2. Let me remove all the code that we don't need right now. And here we see 1 and 2. My goal is to have 1. Press a button and pass a value directly to 2. So I'm going to create in 1. I'm going to create a button and send message to 2. And here I'm going to have a click event that will trigger send message. And at some point, I need component 2 to subscribe to something in order to receive the message directly. So I'm going to use my common service as play as a ground for these two components to communicate. So what I'm going to create inside this common service is a stream or an observable. And a common observable is basically something we learned yesterday, which was the event emitter itself. So I'm going here to create a message property, which is from type event emitter. And I'm going to emit a string this time. Let me instantiate this one. Now I have a property that is stream, and I'm capable of subscribing to the stream or pushing a value inside the stream, something we used yesterday with an output property. Now in 1, I need first an instance of this service. So I'm gonna create an ask for this instance. I'm going to say common. Since it is something I'm not going to use in the template, I'm going to define it as a private property. So common equal inject common service. Let me import inject. Good. Now, whenever I press the button, I need to send something to component 2. Now, I don't want to send the same message over and over. So I'm going to create an input here. And this input will have basically a message. And I'm going to give it a reference here. I'm going to call it input. And every single time I click send message, I want to pass the input.value. So I'm going to receive this string in here. And send it through the stream. So I'm going to say this.common.emit message.emit the message that I'm receiving through the input element. So every single time I press the button, I call send message and I pass to my method the input DOM element.value. This method will receive this, whatever I add inside the input, and pass it through the stream. Now in component 2 should subscribe and receive the message. So let's open component 2. Component 2 needs an instance of the service. Same. Private, common, will inject the common service. Now I have the same instance, so I'm using the same stream. What do I need to do in the constructor, for example? What I can do is to subscribe to this service. Common.message.subscribe. Every single time I receive a message, I'm going to set a local property here, message. I'm hitting the mouse with my elbow. Message. Now I don't have an elbow anymore. Message from 1, and then I'm going to display message 1. Let's create message 1. And every single time I'm gonna receive a message, I'm gonna set the message 1 to the message that I'm receiving. Currently, I have nothing sent from component 1. Hello, send immediately component 2 received hello, because it have an active subscription to this event emitter. Hello 2, send, hello 2 is immediately received inside component 2. So I created some sort of direct communication channel between 1 and 2 without having the app component involved in this communication. Look at app component is completely unaware of what's happening between 1 and 2. And this is a better pattern, basically. Any questions?
Yes, Professor. So, 3 components connecting through the common service, and how is this described as the life cycle?
There is no life cycle in here. I didn't implement any of the life cycle hooks. All I did is I created a service that holds a stream. In component 1, I push value to the stream, and component 2 is subscribing to the stream. Whenever a value arrives, it's going to read it. So there is no lifecycle hooks in this. But I'm glad you brought this up because this is an excellent example for lifecycle hooks. Why? Because every single time you create a subscription, you need to remember to unsubscribe. And especially in a stream like this. What if component 2 was unmounted and mounted back? This subscription doesn't just disappear. You need to end this subscription. So we always remember to implement ng on destroy. And what we like to do is to save this subscription in some sort of a variable that represents a subscription. And now we remember to unsubscribe whenever the component is destroyed. So this is something that we always need to remember to do whenever we subscribe to state or stream. Whenever the component is destroyed and mounted, we remember to remove any subscriptions that we created as a cleanup. Otherwise, your application will have some sort of memory leak. Memory leak means you keep consuming memory by subscribing again and again and again. And that's going to make your application at some point causing memory issues.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Professor,
Yes,
could you please go back to the common service?
yes.
Other I see the profile in here. This is the root register. This is the going the root, or we can change the root letter here.
There is another value that can be used, which is platform. Platform is only when you have multiple applications mounted on the same DOM. Currently, if we check our app module, we bootstrap a single application. So in case you are bootstrapping multiple applications, then you could provide a service at platform level, so all your applications will receive the same instance.
Oh,
and that's
okay.
something you could do as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Let's use a common use of services is communication or state management. So at some point, you're probably going to have an application that has a header that says login, and you don't display any link yet. But after you log in, you probably need to change login to the username and display a button to log out, and then display some sort of links. Now, this is a component called menu. This is a component called header. This is a component that needs to know whether you're signed in or signed off. You have a lot of components here in this tree. All of them, they need to read the user state. So what better place do you save the user state other than the root provider? If at root I have some sort of an object to represent the application state, the header component can subscribe to it. The menu component can subscribe to it. The login the component can subscribe to it and change it after I log in successfully. And once I log in, all components will be notified and immediately reflect the change after I sign in. And that's a very common scenario that you want to do to maintain the application state at root level of your application. So let's try to do that. And I'm going to use here behavior subject because they hold an initial value and they allow me to change it in the future. And they allow me to read the value at any time I want, even without subscription, for one time only. So this is a good practice. I'm going to use a different service for that purpose. ng-generate service. I'm going to call my service state service because it's going to represent my application state. Let's go to the state service. And here I'm going to define my state. So let's define an interface for the state, a type. I'm going to export an interface. I'm going to call it iState. And I'm going to have an underscore ID as a string, full name as a string, and an email as a string, which represent the user. Let's define an initial value for the state. So export initial state. It should be from type iState. And the value would be underscore ID is nothing. Full name is guest. And email, we don't have a value for the email. Let's define an initial state inside the state service. So I'm going to create a behavior subject. I like to keep it private so nobody can accidentally make changes to it. So I'm going to say state, which is private. And this state is basically behavior subject. This behavior subject will hold a value of iState. Let's instantiate this guy. So new behavior subject. And when I create an instance, I provide a default value of the initial value. So by default, my state is for guest, no underscore ID, no email. Now I need to provide tools. Of course, you can use this and call it a day by making it public, and that's fine. But I like to provide more customized tools to make these changes to this guy. For example, if somebody just want to read the value of the state, I can create a property called state. Get state. And get state basically going to be an function that's going to return an observable of the states. So I force anybody who's going to read the state to subscribe to it. So I can return this.state.as observable. So I force somebody before they read the state to subscribe to it. Next, I can create set state in order for anyone to change my value of the state. I can accept here a new state from type iState. So they will pass the new state. And what I can do is to push this state inside the stream. So I can say this dot state dot next. Next is how we push values inside the stream, similar to emit. And then you just push the new value. So I'm going to choose to spread the old value first, this dot state dot value, and then you can spread the new state. This way I can accept like partial changes if I want to. I mean, you could return anything from here. You could just like not return anything. It's up to you. It's fine since the change is synchronous. Let's return this dot state dot value. That would be something nice. So now in order to control this state, I can always either subscribe to it by calling get state and then subscribe to it, or I can use set state to make any changes to it. Let's use this in 1 and 2 to communicate between these two components. So let's say 1 is going to log in. So when I press the button, I am going to log in by providing username and password. Let's not provide anything and not set anything. Let's say this guy is called login, and here is login. After you log in and everything is good, you need to set a new state in your application. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to inject the state service and then use it. I say this dot state service dot set state. Okay. And I can pass like a new state here. For example, underscore ID is 1. Full name is Asaad now. And email is my email. Now, what I also want to do is like after I log in, I want to show a log out button. So I need to read also the state. So let's also read the state. in constructor, I'm going to read the states. So I'm going to say this dot state service dot get state, call it, and then I can subscribe to it. I'm going to receive the state from this method, and I can set it to my state value here, which is I state. And since I'm going to set it in the constructor, so I could just not instantiate this value right now. Now, every time I read the state, I'm going to set it to my state value. So this dot state service dot, this dot state value equal state. So when I start the component, I know that who I am. And let's say I am state value dot full name. So I can say, welcome this guy. Now, as you can see, it says welcome guests, and I'm seeing the login button. What I want to do is to hide the login button and display a logout button after I log in. So how can I do that? I can create another button that's called logout. When I click the button, basically I'm going to clear the state. How can I clear the state? The same way I set the state. I just set state and pass the initial state again. This is called logout. So login will give me the information from the database. Logout will just set it back to guest. Currently, both buttons are displayed, login and logout. I want to display them conditionally. How can I do that? I use ngIf. So I can say ngIf display login if you don't have state value dot underscore ID, and display logout if I do have an underscore ID, because the underscore ID will basically represent that I logged in. So now after I log in, I immediately see my name and I see logout. When I log out, I immediately see guest and login appears again. What if now component 2 needs information about Asaad? All it needs to do is to subscribe to the service. Let me clear that up. And it's very easy. Let's get an instance of state service from type state service, inject the state service for me. And as you can see here, we can display user is, and we can display message 1. That's fine. Let's set message 1 as an empty string. And now, of course, we need to remember ng on destroy and all this stuff. I'm gonna skip that part and then subscribe. So I can say this dot state service dot get state, and then I can subscribe, and I will receive the state. And after I receive the state, I'm going to set the message 1 to the user full name. Say dot, and I can say the full name. Or let's display the email. Now, currently, as you can see, I don't have any value. I don't want to display user is if I don't have a value. So what I can do is I can conditionally display this if the message 1 doesn't exist. So if I have message 1 displayed, otherwise don't display user is. And now by default, I don't have user is. After I log in, I see who's the user, my header change, my buttons change, everything is reactively changed based on the value of my state. So that's how easily we could define a global state in an Angular application. Any questions? Do you need to define set state and get state? And no, you don't. You can simply use a state as a public property here and immediately use this behavior subject or this stream to push data or subscribe to it. But I just like to play it fancier and not provide access to my behavior subject. I can here, for example, create partial states. So for example, get token, get the products, get the card, because I have multiple states that parts in my application, and I don't want to provide one huge object to everybody to use. So I can create like substates, state 1, state 2, state 3, to represent small pieces, and each part of the application only subscribe to these small pieces as needed. So that's also common practice that you probably want to do. Any questions about services
Professor?
and how I use the service for? Yes?
The state here is will store in the local storage or is stored in the memory?
Very good question. If I refresh the app, see I lost my state. So this state is not persisted in local storage. In order to persist this in order storage, you will have to create logic to store it there, and you have to create logic to restore it back. So now what I can do after I log in, once I log in and I get this new state, right? What you can do is you can say local storage dot set item, and then let's call it the item app state, and you can basically JSON.stringify and send this new state there. And you remember when you log out, now you need to clear your local storage. So you say local storage dot clear. Now, after I log in, this is from previous applications. I'm going to clear my local storage. Now, after I log in, you see that I saved my user state in local storage. But when I refresh, I'm back to guest because I'm not reading this when the application starts. So let's refresh the state after I restart the application. Because now when you log in, yes, you write this up and then all your state in memory exists. But after I refresh, the state remains in the local storage, but your application doesn't read it. So how do I read some data that when the application starts? So you can certainly go to app module and have a constructor here to simply trigger some code. But there is a better way to do that, which is a special service that is only triggered when the app bootstrap. And this service is called app initializer. So inside the providers array, I am going to say provide app initializer and use some sort of a function that I create So I'm going to use factory. I'm going to call it bootstrap as part of multiple steps that Angular does when it bootstrap the application. So let's create this function that will trigger when the app starts. I'm going to create here a function, call it bootstrap. And now this function basically should return the function that we trigger. So if I say console log app is starting and then go to the console, I see that this function is triggered by default when the app starts before anything else render or any service. So that's a good step. Now the next thing that we do is to read the local storage and then set it into our application state. So inside this function now, I could say const state equal local storage dot get item and read the app state. If I do have a state, I'm going to do something with it. Otherwise, there is nothing to do. So if I do have a state, it will come as a string. I'm going to create another state. I'm going to call it app state, just not to create conflict, which is json.parse my state object. Now I get the object. My job is to push it inside the service into my global state. So I need an instance of the state service. How can I get an instance in this function? I can add some dependencies here. So I can say this function depends on state service. So Angular can consult the dependency injection framework and prepare this dependency for me. And Angular will hand me this dependency as one by one parameter inside the bootstrap method. So here I'm going to get the state service from type state service. And what I can do with this service is to say state service dot set state, and I can pass the value that I read from the local storage. This way, I refresh the state from the local storage. Now, if I refresh, you can see that my application is still holding the state. Why? Because as the application bootstrap, I read if I have any value inside the local storage. If I do, I'm going to parse it and set it back inside the application memory, so all my components will react appropriately when they render. So I'm glad you brought this up, because that kind of completed the example. Any questions?
Another question, Professor. So in the state, for example, I have multiple state. Let's say another user logs in. I have another state stored in the local storage. But when the application refresh, how the application recognize which user is in?
Because every local storage, I'm not sure I understand the question.
For the app state here, for example, if I have another user 2 logs in, I have another
you have to log
record.
in. You have to log out. If you stayed login, then anybody's using this computer, they can
okay, I got it.
go to the website, just like when I go to Amazon and I immediately see that, oh, they know who I am. I have to sign out of Amazon so another user can use Amazon.
Okay, this is unique. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
beside the state, to handle the state beside store it in local storage. Is there any other technique that we can handle it?
It's most common way to do that is to store it in local storage. Another technique is to store it in session storage. So when you close the tab, they are cleared automatically. If that's something that you want. But when you refresh, you will hold the storage because the same session. The session only ends when you close the tab. So that's probably something you would like to consider. Sometimes store something too sensitive in session storage and less sensitive in local storage, so it is persisted forever unless the user clear it out.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
The last concept we will learn today is making HTTP requests in the Angular application. And we know that how to make HTTP requests, we don't need anybody to teach us how to do that. We can use fetch as URL and pass some options if it was like put or post or different kind, and we're good. But does fetch come with any security filtration? No, it doesn't. Does fetch has a common ground to add or parse headers of the request or the response that we receive from any third-party store? No, it doesn't. You have to configure every single fetch to add or parse header or do any kind of logic that you require commonly with all your requests going out and all the responses coming in. And for that reason, we are going to use a module in Angular called HTTP client module. This module will give you a service that has methods to do all kinds of HTTP requests, plus adding security headers, plus you can easily intercept all the outgoing requests and all the incoming requests going out of your Angular application. So it just makes fetch more fun, more secure, and less repeating code of parsing headers and reading headers. So let's start using this module. The first step that you need to do is to import the module in app module. So I'm going to app module and I say here, hey, import the HTTP client module. For some reason, I don't have suggestions, so I'm going to import the module from Angular common/HTTP. So after I imported this module, now I have access to the service that will allow me to make HTTP call. It's very common that you put all of these HTTP calls in a service layer instead of the component, just to make your testability possible. You don't want to make your components and HTTP tightly coupled. So let's create a service that will make the HTTP call for us. I'm going to create a new service for that purpose. So ng generate service, I'm going to call it data service. Let's open data service. And inside data service, the first thing that I'm going to do is inject the service that will make HTTP calls. So I'm going to say HTTP This is supposed to be private. Nobody's going to use this one other than this service. And I'm going to inject the HTTP client service. Control space, port. Good. Now I'm going to create a method that will give me some data. So let's use something that will display data. Let's say I want to display the JSON placeholder. Let's display list of posts. Does that sound like something interesting to you? So get posts. That should return an observable of the GET request that is sent to this URL. Now in my component, I can just call get post to get the data from this observable. So that's super easy. Better than having this HTTP in my component and have my component aware of URLs and other kind of complexity. Usually we need to type this response, and we do it in a generic of what is the response return type of this observable. So let's see, what do we have? We have user ID, ID, title, and body. So let me type it properly. So I'm going to create here iPost as an interface. And this one is a number. This one is a number. And I have a string. And the last value is also string. Now that I typed my post, I can add the type as a response tag that's coming from this URL. Also, probably the server URL shouldn't be injected here. We could also take this string and have it injected whenever I need it. That's also a possibility. So in order to do that, I'm going to take this string, maybe only the server name. Okay. And here I need to inject the server URL. So let's create a service inject token. So I can say, hey, const URL or const URL token equal new injectable token. This injectable token is going to be just a string. And you can give it some sort of a value to represent what it is. So I'm going to say server URL, just a description. Now that I created an injection token, I need to provide the value to this token. I can do that also from the providers. I can say if somebody asked for this URL token, then provide it with this value. Or use value, not provide. Use this value, which is the string that I added. This URL token, did I? Oh, I misspelled it. So if somebody now needed to inject this, I'm going to provide this value. This is just better. So now my service doesn't need to know what is the, let's get this value. So private server is going to be inject. And I need now the URL token. Let's export this guy. I can import the type. Export. And I can import now the type. Good. Now all is good. I can use now this server in here plus the post. Now my service doesn't need to know about where the URL is configured. It's only responsible for sending HTTP calls. Your component is only responsible on calling a friendly method to get all the data. And I typed all the data that's coming back as an iPost interface. Now that will make my working with getting the post so easy. So let's do that. I'm going to display the data in component 2. And so we already have it. Or let's do it in app. Let's do it in app component. In app component, all you need to use is your data service. So here you can say data equal inject the data service. Once you do that inside your constructor or any other logic that start with the application, what you could simply do is to say this.data.get posts. And that's once you subscribe, we'll give you a response. If we look at the response, we see it's already typed correctly that I am receiving an iPost, and that's good. So I know exactly what I'm dealing with. I can say response dot, I get body ID, title, user ID. However, I made a mistake here because I'm not receiving a post. I'm receiving an array of posts. So let me go to my data service and correct that. I'm receiving an array of iPosts. Now, when I hover over response, I see that it's an array of iPosts, and that's good. So you can simply have here, let's call this data service. Let's create here a property called posts, which is an array of iPost array, and it starts as an empty array. And after you receive the response, you can set this post to the response. And now you are able to display both of them, all the data. So I can say here, hey, get the posts and parse it as JSON string. As you can see, I displayed all the data as a string inside the template. That's something probably you don't want to do. You want to display every single post in its own list item. So for that to happen, you can create an ordered list that has list items. Every list item has an ng4. You can say let post of posts, and then you display only the post dot, because I already typed. I know that I have a property called title, and now when I save, you see the post titles are listed in the app. So your component is very clean now. All you need to do is to ask for the service to give you the posts, subscribe, and get exactly what you want. You can read it and display it in your templates. Any questions? A common technique of subscribing is not to subscribe in the class. Instead of getting here array of iPost, we could get the observable itself. We can get an observable that has array of posts. But how can I display an observable in the template? That's not possible. Here in the constructor, I can say, hey, this dot post equal, go get the post. But get post is going to give me an observable. See, it's an observable. How can I consume the observables? In this case, you can subscribe to it by using a special pipe called async. As you can see, I display the data correctly. So what happened here is this pipe subscribes to this observable and pass the data to iterate over, and I display it. Now in my constructor, I didn't need to .subscribe to read the data. That's very common in Angular applications that we subscribe in the template using the async pipe. Any questions? Now, I mentioned that we like to use HTTP library, HTTP client to send requests. Why? Because it gives me security headers automatically. Plus, it gives me also flexibility of modifying any request headers or parsing any response headers. So let's do that. First, let's inspect the request. Does it have any special things? So I'm going to inspect here, go to network, find this request that was sent /post. And I see in the request headers, some security headers were added to me. And this is really good. All the sec fetch, all of them are added automatically by Angular. Let's add our own headers. Let's say we want to send a token or something or some secret to the backend in order for the backend to recognize who are we. Common technique to do that is by creating an interceptor. Interceptor job is basically intercept any request and any response going out and in only if you use the HTTP client. Let's create an interceptor. So ng generate interceptor, and I'm going to call it add secret. A class was created called add secret. Let's take a look at it. As you can see, it has a method. This class implements HTTP interceptor interface, and it has a method that's always calling next. All of you are familiar with Express middleware. An Express middleware has something called next. What does next do? Send something out, right? It's the same concept here in an Angular interceptor. So we have some logic. Next means send the request to the backend. And when we receive a response, we can intercept the response that's coming after we call next. That's how we intercept the request and the response. Now, before I add any logic here to change in the request, we need to provide this. Do you see that this service is provided anywhere? No, I do see injectable, but do you see that this injectable is provided? Nope, it's not. Because it's up to the developer to provide it only for parts in the application. Now I'm going to provide this interceptor globally in the application, which is also very common. So what I can do here is go back to my app module and provide my interceptor. So I can say provide if anybody want to intercept, ask for a class called HTTP interceptor, then use my class, which is add secret. Also, adding a secret interceptor to your application logic is one of many. So you have to pass a flag multi-true as well. Now that I provided my interceptor, let's make sure it works. So I'm going here to console.log. Interceptor works. Let's inspect. So interceptor works, which means now my interceptor is triggering every single time I send a request. That's good. So what I could do to this interceptor is clone the request to add my own headers. So I can create here request clone equal request.clone. And I can set any headers I want to this new request. And now this request, I can pass it to next. So I make changes to the request by cloning the request, and then I send it out. Let's set, for example, a property called secret, and the value would be my name, anything you would like to add, probably token, probably any value that you request. Now I know that my request is cloned. Let's go to network, go to post, check what happened to the request headers, and I should see that the secret property was added to the header with the value of my name. So any request from any place in around the application now will intercept the request and modify the request header. So probably this is a good place that you inject your application state and see if you do have a state, you send out your user identification, your token, your whatever way to identify your client state to the stateless REST API. So this is how you could do that using an interceptor. Any questions about the interceptor?
Yeah, Professor, so interceptor works as middleware and checking the request headers.
Correct, 100%. It's a middleware that intercept anything request going out to your application. And as you can see, there is next here. So it means it is middleware.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, another question. So intercept checks the request when we have the HTTP request. Like how I just missed that part. How we check the requests, which folder had it?
I didn't get. How do you want to check request for what?
Yeah, how we check the how we using the interceptor?
Oh, how I provided the interceptor?
Yes.
After you create the class from the CLI, you go to app module and you say, if somebody asks for this class, HTTP interceptor, use mine as one of many. So I just added a provider to the provider array of your main module. That's how I provided the interceptor that I added. You can create multiple interceptors, add them all one by one. For example, one to check the certain server, because you have the request, basically You know all the information about what are you trying to do. Let me print out the request for you. Now, console. Now, as you can see, I know the URL, I know the HTTP verb, I know the params, I know everything about the request. So you could condition that, hey, I need to create an interceptor. If I'm going to server 1, do this. If I'm going to server 2, do that. If I'm sending something in the post request, then do this. So you can add here multiple interceptors. Each one is responsible for doing certain logic in your application. So you don't have to put them all in a single place.
Okay.
And you
thank
just provide them one by one here inside the providers array of app module. You're welcome. Any other questions? So for your homework today, this afternoon, we want to extend the backend application that we created last week about meals and ingredients and stuff, and create an interface for this app now to display list of meals and delete meal by ID. So what we wanna display is, for this to work, you need to add middleware called cores. Probably we talked about it a little bit. Why? Because now my Angular application is working on 4200 port, your Express on some different ports. You cannot send AJAX calls in the browser to these two different ports. So you need to allow cores at the back end. Now, after you do that, you need to send request to get all list of meals and display all list of meals in your application. Each meal should have a button to delete. When you press the button, you send a request to delete. Once you get confirmation that the meal is deleted, you update your state. You don't need to refetch the list of meals. You just update the state to filter out this meal, and Angular will patch the DOM and remove this meal from the list of meals. So that's basically your task that you need to do in the afternoon. My preference is to use services, create a service for state, create another service for HTTP, make it the application just like what I was doing, and yeah, maybe set another global space to save the list of everything, and you could change that. It's up to you, but be creative in separating all these layers so you don't write an application as a single file. The goal we're using a framework is basically to bring all these pieces with single responsibility classes. So don't make any changes to the back end, just add cores, make sure cores is there, and just work on the front end to the list of meals and delete the meals. Yes?
Are we doing on top of the last assignment
Yes.
5? Or
Yes.
are we doing new project?
No, this is on top of the other project. This project has the back-end code already done. What you want to start now is a new Angular application, which represent the front-end code. Each one is two separate applications. This is an app, this is an app.
Yes.
So we will be just use this one. You don't need to push this code. You just run this application and test with it. And you just need to work on the front-end code today. This is already done.
Yeah, so we installed the course on the previous assignment, or
Yes,
we create
if it wasn't there, then add it, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor, course is checked for every kind of request or just
Yes,
for
open course. Yeah, open course globally. So you don't need to open it only for this specific server. You don't need to do that. But if you want to do that, you can send configuration to only open it for a request coming from port 4200. But okay, this is just a practice example, and you don't need to provide that kind of level of security at this moment.
So course is checked for like even when you are making a GET request or when you're making a POST request, like it's not just required for POST, right?
It depends. It depends. Some requests will require course, some requests will not. But most of the requests that you will do will require course because probably they are posts or GET, even GET, since we are modifying sometimes headers at the client, the browser will decide that this is not a standard request and will request a course communication with the backend before it sent the actual request. This is why activate CORS ahead of time, so you avoid any kind of like surprises. Oh, this is CORS, this is not CORS. It's hard to tell. Because not all requests will be elevated to become pre-flight using CORS. The browser will decide based on security and whether you're making any changes. For example, whenever you try to post JSON, this is need to be secure. If you're trying just to get data, probably that doesn't need to be secure. But if you're trying to get some data and you modify the headers, then the browser will decide, oh, I'm sending a non-standard header or some information in the header. So the browser will decide that this request should be coarse. Since Angular is adding its own security headers to the front end, I believe that all requests that are sent should be sent as coarse.
And what do you mean by use title case pipe in the second last line?
Oh, to display the name of the meal or the title of the meal nicely. There is a pipe in Angular called title case. So you just meal or title case, and that will display the meal nicely, basically. Title case pipe, search Google, Angular. That's how you use it. And it's just change the value to title case. Any other questions? All right, let's meditate and go to lunch break.